Hello, everybody. Welcome to this talk. And well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to Conchita and the team at the university and to the European Bank for hosting me here. It's my first time in Luxembourg. And what I will present to you today is based actually on the findings from a report that the bank put out about 2 years ago. World Development Report is done every year on different topics. About 2 years ago, the topic was the impact of digital technologies on development. Now, that is a very broad topic, of course. Today, what I'm going to do is focus on the link between technologies, labor markets, and how that impacts inequality. Because this is an inequality series, and I was told that I should emphasize the inequality link. There are, of course, many other benefits of technology, which are discussed in that report. And if you're interested, I encourage you to go take a look at it. But maybe also in the discussion, we can talk about it. So we live in an era of unprecedented technological breakthroughs. There are two characteristics to sort of the so-called third and fourth industrial revolution, which in a way are really different from, of course, past processes of technological change. The first is that the pace of change is exponential. Just to give an example here, from the invention of the first phone to the first website, it took about 115 years. Then from the first website to the first iPhone, it took 16 years. And now, of course, we're talking about the Internet of Things, interconnectivity, etc. I could give you examples in manufacturing, but other examples from the invention of the first printing press to the actual invention of the printer, it was about 500 years. And it took only 30 years to go from the printer to the 3D printer. When the human genome was decoded, it took about 13 years, about $3 billion project. Now you can buy a kit for less than $1,000 and you can decode your genome yourself in a few hours. So exponential pace and the cost of the technologies, this is very important, of course, for adoption, is actually going down very fast too. Now, again, when we think about the penetration and the impact and the expansion of these technologies, broadly speaking, across the population, but also across countries, we also see a difference from a previous process of technical change. Like here, I'm showing, simple thing, access to improved water, sanitation, or even schooling. These were, or have been at the time, technological breakthroughs. How you massify education and how do you give access to these basic services. You see that the pace of expansion has been pretty much linear. When you look at mobile phone technology, the internet, or broadband, you again see that the pace of expansion is exponential. Just to give some numbers, they're staggering, about 3 billion, and these are probably already in the low side because I think the data is from 3 years ago. Over 2 to 3 billion people across the planet are actually using either the internet, mobile phones, or social media, of course. When you look at how this compares across countries, the developed and the developing world, again, look at Africa here. 67% of, I think this is households, have access to a mobile phone. We're not talking smartphones, but nevertheless, a mobile phone, which obviously has great implications in terms of their access to information, interconnectivity, etc. Now, of course, access and the expansion of access has been unequal and probably will remain unequal. Again, data for taking Africa as a region There are inequalities across, the use of technology. I think in this case, is the use of the internet between men and women, between urban and rural, youth. There is an intergenerational difference. I think this is true in almost every country too. And of course, between rich and poor. So we cannot, of course, negate that any potential benefits that come with these technologies will be potentially propagated in an unequal way. So then, the question is, are these technologies going to help improve welfare and reduce poverty, or will they exacerbate inequality? And again, I'm going to focus here on the labor market link. I'm not going to talk about other channels, which could be as important or even maybe more important, like productivity growth. So growing opportunities, if you're an educated worker, you're very highly skilled, chances are that you're going to benefit from this. I'll show you some data on this. All this telework is giving access to workers in developing countries, so workers that had probably no possibility of finding a good paying job are now working from their homes or from computer labs. There is, of course, Uber and Airbnb, which again is giving some people opportunities to generate a second income. And even in, in developing countries, in rural areas, farmers or self-employed people are actually getting access to information on how much they can charge for their produce in markets and doing better because of that. Now, there are threats, and those are the ones that get usually emphasized in the press. The robots are coming, be careful. Of course, there's a lot of debate about companies like Uber because, even though essentially the drivers operate as if they were employees, they do not have the typical relationship. They don't have access to the standard social benefits. And the concern is that this may actually, therefore, leads to inequality. Now, first question is how much employment is being created? Because one of the main, one of the first benefits is, okay, these sectors create jobs directly. So how important is this? This is data from OECD for, I think Luxembourg is somewhere there. There. What percentage of employment is accounted by the ICT sector? And this is relatively dated. It's for 4 or 5 years ago, but in almost every country is less than 5%. Okay, so these are still, from the point of view of employment, relatively small sectors. Now, if we look at the data for developing countries, it's obviously even worse in the sense that those sectors are even smaller as a fraction of total employment. But the key thing is that when you look at the intensity of use of ICT, of digital technologies in jobs, that fraction actually is higher, which means essentially jobs that could be potentially impacted directly by the progress and expansion of these digital technologies. You see, for example, in these countries in South Asia, Africa, and Eastern Central Europe, let's say Macedonia, up to more than 20% of employment actually is in a way intensive in the use of ICT, even though those are jobs that are outside the ICT sector. Okay, so the impact at the end of the day on employment and earnings is going to be a balance between two forces. The first is whether technology actually complements workers, and that is true for skilled workers. So that's what's typically called skill bias technical change, or whether technology can substitute for some type of labor. So whether there could be labor displacement. The research so far, and there has been research studied in the US and then in OECD countries in Europe, but now this work has been expanded in this World Development Report to developing countries, indicates that what is crucial is really whether the tasks associated to the jobs are routine or non-routine, which essentially means, can you actually codify the task into a script or an algorithm that then you can automate through a computer or through a robot. Looking at the data, and I can explain maybe in the questions how we get to, or how the authors actually get to measure this. But say taking existing labor force surveys and mapping the data with a dictionary of occupations that essentially say, okay, if you're a lawyer, what are the tasks associated with being a lawyer? And then to those tasks, you map the skills that are needed to carry out those tasks. And then you can classify those skills as to whether they are associated to tasks that are routine or non-routine. And it's a bit more complicated because you have routine analytical, routine manual, or non-routine social, or non-routine analytical. But at the end of the day, as I said, the most important distinction is whether it's routine or non-routine. You see here, let's focus on the OECD countries. The orange line, this is the fraction of employment that is intensive in routine, cognitive, or manual tasks. And you see that that is going down over the period. Developing countries, same thing. Okay? When you look at the fraction of employment that is intensive in the non-routine, whether it is interpersonal or analytical, which is the red line, is going up. So in a whole spectrum of countries, this covers around 100 countries in the world, we do see this consistent trend that was first identified with data from the US. Now, let me go back a little bit. You probably are familiar, this is what has been called in the literature the polarisation of labor markets. So sort of the hollow out of the middle. Because typically the jobs that are intensive in these routine tasks are jobs that were associated with white-collar jobs. So, secretary, a clerk, those are jobs that were very intensive and that today, when you call customer service, you are likely to be talking to an algorithm or a robot. And so those jobs are the ones that are disappearing. Actually, it's not the bottom of the ladder, the manual jobs. If you're a truck driver, still today, you have a job and you haven't been as affected, even though, again, maybe that is coming too. Let me just show you this graph from a study that was done in the US, which I find very interesting because it gets to give examples of what are the types of occupation we're talking about. This was a study by a professor in Harvard, Deming. So here in the y-axis, he has a measure of whether the jobs in the relevant occupations require social skills. And again, we can talk later about what that is, but essentially are skills that are required for interactions with other people, customer service, teamwork, etc. And on the x-axis is the intensity of use of numeracy or math skills. Green means that the share of employment of those occupations have actually grown in total employment. I guess that's purple. Purple means that it has fallen. And the one that you cannot see, because of course technology sometimes does fail, is the ones that are about the same. But I think what you can see here, all the greens, most of the green, are in the quadrant of jobs and occupations that are intensive on both social skills and math skills. So these are the jobs that, in the case of the US, have been in higher relative demand. Now, we don't have quite the same data to do the same analysis for developing countries, certainly not for a lot of countries, but an approximation to that analysis, which was done for this World Development Report, again, just taking this typology of occupations that are intensive in the non-routine skills, whether cognitive or interpersonal, those that are intensive in the routine, whether cognitive or manual, and then what we can call low skill, which are intensive in manual, non-routine. And you have here a whole spectrum of countries from Macedonia, Turkey, all the way to China. let me call your attention to the orange bar. That one is the one that is in the middle. Those are the sort of middle skill jobs. Those that are intensive in the routine task. And you can see that in almost every country, this again is a large number of developing countries, that fraction of has been going down. So that labor market polarization is been happening. There is one exception that I highlighted for you there, which is China. And the first time that the author of the report put forward this graph, everybody was surprised and say, okay, but why? And we can talk about it in the discussion a bit more. I'm actually working on a report for China where we have looked again at the data. You know, access to data is tricky in China, so this was done with not the best data. We were able to get better data, and I'll show you results that suggest that, yes, indeed, China was an exception, but not anymore. Oh, there it is. I forgot that I put that graph. Okay, so if you actually get more detailed data, and this means basically 3 or 4 digit level occupation data for China, and you know, we did it through some researchers, Chinese researchers, you actually see that, and so the first 2 graphs on the top are, again, the share of jobs that are intensive in non-routine cognitive or non-routine interpersonal. And those in the bottom are those intensive in routine. You can see that between 2000 and 2010, the trend in China was actually contrary to the rest of the world, right? So it was the jobs that were intensive in non-routine that were actually going down, and routine were actually increasing. But something happened in 2010, or around 2010. We only have, you know, this kind of yearly data, points of data. We don't have the whole series. Where the trend actually is reversed. And now it's looking like consistent with polarization. Now, when you look into what has happened in China, indeed, China has been very aggressively pursuing a policy of a fast innovation of new technologies. I mean, just in the period 2010-15, the use of robots in manufacturing has increased by 60%. Today, China is the highest, of course, it's a large country, but today is the largest importer of robots in the world. And I mean, this company, Foxconn, that manufactures the iPhone, just last year automated around 60,000 jobs altogether. Now, you know, the question is what's going to happen next? What's, you know, looking forward? And this is where we get into the, you know, either speculative or, you know, sort of discipline projections, if you want, of what may happen. There's 2 researchers, Frey and Osborne from Oxford, that actually did an exercise, and they published a paper that has been cited a lot in the economies, etc. And again, we can discuss maybe in the question and answer session how they went about it. But essentially, what they did is say, okay, if we look at existing technologies today, the ones that are in the pipeline, so in development, so they talked to a bunch of technologists, and the ones that are expected to be available in 10, 15 years. I guess that by the time when they did this work, let's say self-driving cars were in that pipeline. And people now say that it's a matter of 3, 4, 5 years until we actually see it, you know, in the streets more massively. Well, if you do that, and then you say, okay, in the current employment structure of countries, what are the jobs that are more susceptible to automation? And they come up with a percentage, say, of total employment, what is the fraction of jobs that is, and they call it susceptible to be automated. We were just discussing before that perhaps this is a, you know, too much of a leap, you know, forward. One perhaps more reasonable interpretation is this is the share of jobs that is likely to be transformed by new technologies. Maybe they don't disappear, but certainly tasks that are routine in those jobs are going to be automated, and therefore the way you carry the work is going to be different, and workers need to be prepared for that. Well, anyway, if you take the data essentially, and again, this is done across a whole range of developing countries. They did it for the US, the UK, etc. On average, the chance that a child born, let's say today, finds a job in an occupation that looks like today, let's just say that it has not been transformed by technology, is 50%. Okay? Again, we're in the, in the realm of speculation, but this is, the only way you can look into the future is to make educated guesses. Now, a very recent analysis, and this is not looking forward, this is looking backward, a very serious study by David Autor from MIT and a student of his, Restrepo, actually looked in the US at the impact of robots, not just digital technologies, but adoption of robots on employment in the US and wages. And David Autor came to present this work at the bank, and he said that the first time they got the results, he was very surprised himself. He was not expecting to find this. And actually, he said, before we came out with the paper, I made sure that there was no mistake. And they say, well, this is what the data is saying. This graph is from their paper. Essentially, the thing to take from here, the measure on the x-axis is the change in the exposure to robots of commuting zones, and they just define those to be areas where people live in a metropolitan area where they can commute to jobs. There's a sort of a definition in the US for that. And then the measure in the y-axis is what happened to employment. The percentage change in employment on the left, the percentage change in log wages. And what they found, which is different from previous research, is that robots in the US during this period actually seem to be having negative impacts on both employment and wages. So it's just both quantity and prices. Because, it doesn't have to be like that. In the other case, you may have polarization on occupation, but you may still have gains in wages because people are able to move to other jobs and maybe they do better and there's productivity increases. This is suggesting that any indirect effect coming from productivity gains in these areas are not percolating into the labor market to offset the displacement that actually happens. Because the thing that is different about a robot is that I think their estimate is that for every, I want to be careful, for every robot that is adopted, I better look it up. I think it's 7 jobs are displaced, but I may be getting that wrong. But so.
Could you explain to us a moment, what do you have on the vertical axis? That is change in wages, right?
Yeah, that's changing log wages between 1990 and 2007.
So is there a zero somewhere?
Yeah, and I'm.
Well, they haven't hit it yet. There it is.
Yeah.
Okay, no, I can see that.
Sorry, again, it's white.
No, I was just seeing where the negative growth.
Yeah, and it's not all negative everywhere, but on average, and what the line tells you is that there is a decline. And the impact is actually modest, right? We're not talking about huge, reductions in employment, but still. I mean, again, in conversation with David Autor, he would say, look, if we were to do this in 5 years, I would not be surprised if these trends were reversed, because maybe it takes time for people to move and, for the sort of mobility of workers to arbitrage the labor market. Yes, it is entirely possible.
Do these two graphs tell us also that the change in wages is even more than a change in employment?
No, I don't think so. No, I think it's a matter of, well, they're in the same scale, but I don't think they tested, whether those two things are statistically different. I don't remember that they can say that one, was more impacted than the other. Maybe even if the actual number is, we don't know if statistically they're different. Okay.
If it
yes.
wasn't long on the wages, wouldn't the curve look much worse? If I remember rightly, in that case, log, it makes it look like a gentle sloping straight line.
Right.
But actually, we've got an exponential curve going down.
Right. Yeah, well, I guess what you're saying is that, there is a difference when you look at the distribution. So if you look at low wage, average wage, or high wage.
Well, I'm just speaking mathematically.
Yeah.
Maybe we should leave this for the Q&A,
Okay.
otherwise we lose the trends.
Let's get back to it. Okay. Oops. Just to put out there that, again, this is, again, consistent at least with what we have seen in terms of several measures of labor income inequality. So, for example, if you take data on the share of labor income in total output, that share has been falling, in the last couple decades across many countries. Not everywhere, but across many countries. I think that red is Luxembourg. Now, of course, we cannot say that this is because of technology. There's a lot that is happening. There are studies that show that trade, particularly offshoring of jobs to China and other countries, has had an impact in the US or other countries. There's research showing that there's a role for institutions, so the diminishing power of unions. So there are many other factors going on, but there are studies that suggest that technology is certainly one of the key drivers. So, and now I'm getting to the end of the talk. The question is, what does this mean for policy? If we take, the concern that, okay, at the very minimum, these technologies are going to impact labor markets, employment, perhaps differently than previous rounds of technical change, without saying that, robots are going to take over and there's not going to be jobs for anybody. We leave that to Hollywood. But what we can say is that the nature of work, the skills that are going to be required, are different. I think that is a conclusion that is warranted. So, that just said that. The pace of change is going to be faster. So that means that people are going to be more adaptable. The chances that people have to change jobs over their working lives is higher. These technologies are disrupting the traditional employer-employee relationships. Again, the Uber example, and therefore are putting pressure on traditional social protection, social insurance schemes that are based on having a contractual relationship where you actually get social benefits because you have a job. So what should we do? And these are just headlines because I don't have time to go into detail, but of course I'll be happy to engage in any of these on specifics. The first is that what the implication for schools. So how do you prepare children today for the world of work of 15, 20 years, which is when they're going to enter the labor market at the earliest? There needs to be an emphasis on the skills that are complementary to technology. We were just talking yesterday, I think about 2 years ago, the FDA, the Food, Drug, and Administration in the US, approved the first robot to administer anesthesia in hospitals. And of course, that was kind of a scary thought for many people, but it was approved because there was an, experimental evidence that actually it did better than humans. It committed fewer errors, and therefore there were fewer malpractices, and and that was now 3 years ago. We don't see these robots all over in hospitals. There has been a lot of rejection from patients to the notion that a robot is going to administer anesthesia without the involvement of a human being. And at the end of the day, even if that technology exists and technically probably does better, the adoption has been curtailed. But maybe it's a norm thing, so the social norms might change. I don't know, maybe the millennials will be actually happier to have a robot do that than a human. But that means that people who are studying now in medicine, School of Medicine, to become anesthesiologists need to have a plan B. Okay? So we need to be emphasizing skills that help people learn to learn, because we all are going to have to reinvent in a way ourselves, because jobs are going to keep changing. That has implication for training programs. We cannot just focus on narrow technical vocational skills. In many cases, workers have missed out on acquiring foundational skills, whether they are cognitive or socio-emotional. And more training programs are incorporating aspects of training on those skills. It has implication for lifelong learning. Again, this idea that for 20 years in your life, you go to school, you learn, and then you go to work, and you keep learning on the job. Yes, you will keep learning on the job, but chances are that you're going to have to complement that learning with learning in some way, whether it's through online courses or whatever, so that if you have to change occupation, you're able to do that. And there are countries that are experimenting with things like training accounts, where you give people a lump sum amount to be used for training throughout their working lives. What I said about social protection schemes, again, there's a question of, in countries where you have very strict labor regulations, this is something we're discussing, for example, now in China, the pace of adoption can be slowed down by having very strict regulations, but actually it could backfire for workers. Because if you have very high, say, firing costs, you're making labor more expensive than technology. So you're actually, in a way, aiding adoption at a faster pace than would be optimal. And so that needs to be rethought. And then, really on this, again, we can debate. There's not easy answers of how these social protection schemes need to be redesigned. I mean, there are questions of, okay, if people are going to be changing jobs so often, and in some cases they're going to have jobs in which they're not going to have access to these benefits, they're not going to be able to contribute to a pension system, does it really make sense still to have separate system, one for formal workers and some form of compensation for informal, or you need to delink completely benefits from having a job? That has fiscal implications, it has incentive design implications. For people who are not able to adapt so much, those left behind, what do you do? There are countries that are, again, testing universal basic income schemes, and there's issues of work disincentives that may come from those, and we need to learn more about them. That's it. Thank you very much.